bad rap. They're actually very good for us in many ways. They help our body digest food. They help our environment recycle waste. So overall, microbes, I think, are really important and helpful to our health and the world. But there are some bad bugs out there, and our lab is focused on designing ways to stop the bad bugs, but at the same time, preserve the good bugs. So we work on decontamination methods, chemicals, and physical things like UV light that can kill harmful bacteria or viruses or fungi, and also developing vaccines. And vaccines are a little bit trickier than just shining light on something or, say, pouring bleach on it. But I think they have an even more profound effect that you'll see as we get into some of the slides. So I don't have many slides. I think there are about 20 total. And I'm hoping to get through them in half an hour, maybe less, and leave lots of times for questions about vaccines in general, about COVID, or even some of the decontamination methods that we do, whatever you're interested in. Okay, so overall, for what are we trying to do with the vaccine? Nobody likes giving shots, so why do we go to the trouble of making these? Well, the goal is really to very specifically teach the immune system to understand and recognize a foreign microbe, a virus or a bacteria, and then encourage it to respond really, really rapidly to that organism so that it can cause a disease in the body, so it doesn't really get a foothold. So in a way, we're trying to build a protective defense kind of inside the body, but still it keeps things outside the body in a sense. So that's really our goal of a vaccine. So just a quick question, and I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID. You hear a lot about it on the news. It's kind of hard not to hear about it if you turn on the news at all. But does everyone know, and I'm kind of curious, this is something for you to think about and discuss if you're in a group, what kind of virus causes COVID, the infectious disease, and where did it come from? Is it a rabies virus that came from skunks? Is it a flu virus that came from chickens? Is it a coronavirus from bats? So you probably know that you can get rabies from skunks and raccoons. You can catch a flu, bird flu, from chickens. And the coronavirus that causes COVID is thought to have arisen from bats. So I don't know if you knew that. So what is a coronavirus? So I'm a scientist, so we like to really get down to the details. This is showing a cross-section of the virus, kind of like slicing it in half. On the left is an electron microscope image that's been kind of enhanced with kind of green color. On the right is a cartoon that shows the structure in a little more detail. Essentially, there's a core in the center of the virus that holds its genetic information. In the case of coronavirus, it's RNA. And then that's wrapped, it's protected in proteins, protected in lipids. And then on the outside, it has these spiky things that look a little bit like lollipops on the electron micrograph image, little blobs, that are very specific kind of keys for the virus uses to gain access to our cells. So those are unique for the virus and allow it to attack a very specific receptor on our cells and cause an infection. So these are things when you're thinking of, well, what would make a good vaccine? What does the immune system respond to? Those spike proteins have been the favorite target so far to try and stop the virus from invading. But now, just a little bit more about coronavirus. So I'm sure you've heard of COVID. It's kind of hard, unless you've lived under a rock for the past year or so. Actually, in the last 20 years, there's been 5 new coronaviruses that have kind of broken out and attacked the human population. So you may not remember back to 2002, the first respiratory coronavirus that emerged, again, we think from bats, was called SARS initially. And that's for severe acute respiratory syndrome, so a very severe lung infection that could be deadly. So with the SARS outbreak in 2002, it was very limited and contained, but still of about the 8,000 people that caught it, 10% of those people died, so a very deadly disease. So there were 2 others that broke out in 2004, and these circulate, they really cause only a mild disease. These are circulating worldwide, you may have caught them. They're very easy to transmit, but they just give minor cold symptoms like runny nose, watery eyes, scratchy throat. And there were before 2000, two other coronaviruses in humans that also caused kind of mild cold-like symptoms. So there are now at least 4 human coronaviruses, different types, that cause just minor cold symptoms. In 2012, changed another coronavirus that we call MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, broke out in the Middle East, and that is very deadly. But luckily, that's still circulating, but it's contained to the Middle East and Asia. And of course, you've all heard about SARS, I'm sorry, COVID-19, which has been also given the name SARS-CoV-2 because it's very similar in some ways to the original SARS from back in 2002, that has been now circulating for about a year in the human population. So, that coronavirus is bad, but there's really a trend in the last 20 years of coronaviruses kind of coming at us, some deadly, some not. So something to think about as far as what we may want to design for vaccines and preventions in the future. So how does this happen? I mean, how can these viruses just come out of nowhere? Well, we think when these viruses grow, say in bats, where we think a lot of them originated, they're not really deadly to the bats. They're just normal viruses that maybe give the bats the sniffly nose. But when they grow, they make mistakes. So viruses, when they grow, want to multiply very rapidly. So it's all about speed, grow as fast as you can. And when they do that, they make mistakes. And, usually that's okay. They're still able to keep going and transmit in their host. But what that does is it makes some variants that can grow in new host species. So we think what happens, since, we really don't come into contact with bats a lot, we think those bat coronaviruses changed a little bit, and that allowed them to infect other animal species that are closer to humans. So for the case of the original SARS, we think maybe it went through a wild cat and then jumped to humans. For MERS, we think it went through a camel, lots of camels in the Middle East, and then jumped to humans. And for the most recent one, for the new COVID, we're not really sure. They're still trying to figure out, what animal species, if any, it jumped through on the way from bats to us. Maybe it's the pangolin. And I had never heard of a pangolin before, but there it is. So these viruses, because they can change a lot, they gain new abilities. And sometimes that can cause human infections and cause deadly human infections. Okay, so now we're getting into some of the medical outcomes. What happens when we get exposed to a virus? So in many cases, we don't have any symptoms at all. So that's the best possible outcome, right? So the virus, we get exposed, it gets into our cells and grows, but our immune system takes care of it, doesn't cause any problems. And that's what we call asymptomatic. So no runny nose, no watery eyes, or so on. But you may have mild symptoms. If the virus gets going a little bit, your immune system recognizes it and tries to flush it out. So again, watery eyes, fever, runny nose, cough it out. And unfortunately for some folks, it can be a very severe infection, even life-threatening. So those are the ones especially that we would want to prevent with vaccines. But then overall, of all of these, is that really the only one we want to prevent with vaccines? So here's another thought question. So you have a range. So maybe most people that get infected with COVID have either mild symptoms or asymptomatic. So we're really just trying to prevent the severe and deadly disease. So why, in other words, if this is happening in the elderly, why don't we just vaccinate the elderly rather than, you all and me? Hopefully I'm not part of the elderly yet. So think about that. Is it really just the people that are most prone to the disease that we should vaccinate? Really, the vaccines are designed to prevent spreading of the virus to both people that would be healthy and maybe have an asymptomatic infection, as well as the people that are more susceptible to the more severe forms. So the virus gets shed and spread by everyone, even the folks that don't have any symptoms, and the vaccines want to stop spread. So overall, everyone really needs to get to the vaccine. If you only vaccinate the folks with the severe symptoms, the virus will continue to circulate in the population. And really the goal of the vaccine is to remove the virus from circulation through our defenses. So everyone is targeted with the vaccine for prioritizing the folks that are most impacted, that are most likely to be exposed and have a severe outcome. But really to eliminate these new viruses from the population, everyone needs to be vaccinated to keep the virus from circulating. So an example of this is shown in these slides. I'm going to show some data slides. This is showing on the y-axis the number of people that were infected, usually kids, in the United States per 100,000 patients of measles, mumps, and rubella. So you know there is an effective vaccine now called MMR for treating and preventing measles, mumps, and rubella. But before the vaccine was licensed, it's showing it was approved for use in the population in the 1960s. The infection rates, there was nothing to stop the infections and by these viruses. So they kind of fluctuated from 300 to 400 per 100,000 in the US for measles, a little bit less for mumps, and somewhat fewer for rubella. But when you don't have a vaccine and you have highly transmissible viruses like measles or coronavirus, the virus just keeps circulating and there's really nothing to stop it. So the vaccines are really effective at, once they get used widely and then they're good at stopping the virus, they can all but eliminate it from the population. So you see in the 70s, the numbers of people getting infected by measles dropped to almost zero. And where you see little blips, I mean, we haven't eradicated measles totally yet from the population, but there are areas of the country and some groups that don't believe in vaccines. And this is the populations where the virus is still spreading. So you can get a vaccine and not be worried about measles, mumps, or rubella, or you can take chances, not get the vaccine and get the virus. And some of these can be deadly, very serious viruses. So just another case, because I think this is such a great effect to show, and it really kind of drives me to keep working on vaccines because they're such a good thing for public health, is what happens with polio, or what happened when the polio vaccine was licensed. I think the polio vaccine effort in the late 50s was very similar to what we're seeing now with the COVID vaccine in 2021 now. The two gentlemen that drove vaccine production or helped create the vaccine are shown on the left-hand side. One, Al Sabin, who's on top, did his work over in Cincinnati, so not far from northern Kentucky. He developed the Sabin vaccine for polio. And then the gentleman on the bottom, a little bit further away in Pittsburgh, Jonas Salk, developed another version of the polio vaccine. And polio, as we know, can cause paralysis and death. It normally, though, it's highly transmissible. Basically, all kids got it, in the 50s, and parents were afraid of it. Their kids getting it, of course, because the rate of paralysis, as you can see on the graph, was about 5%. So everyone got polio, but only about 5% had the really severe forms where they got paralyzed and couldn't breathe and so on. And this is showing basically the number of paralytic cases in the US around the time the vaccine got widely used. So 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 kids every year in the US were being paralyzed by polio before the vaccine. But after the vaccine got widely distributed and used, you see that number going down to essentially zero. So again, the vaccines are super effective at eliminating deadly viruses from populations. Polio, we tried to eradicate worldwide by 2000 or 2010. There's still pockets of it in Asia that are still growing where the vaccine, it's difficult to distribute vaccines to everyone in the world as you're learning with COVID. And until we can do that effectively, there will still be some pockets of polio left, but we hope that this will be one disease that will be eradicated very soon, very shortly with vaccines.
We do have a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Someone is asking, what if you can't get the vaccine? I'm not sure if they're talking about the COVID one or some of these others, either because of health problems or maybe if you don't have health insurance.
That's a really good question. So if you have health problems, definitely you should be careful about getting the vaccine. And even say pregnant women also could be at risk for getting the vaccine. So you really should check with your physician, your doctor, and see. It's usually vaccines work really well in healthy people. If you're immune suppressed, maybe because of genetics or other factors, if you're taking drugs that suppress your immune system, if you're pregnant, or if you have other health issues, you have to be very careful. Some vaccines are safe to give in those conditions. Other vaccines may not be. So it's really, you have to be careful. It's a case by case kind of basis. And if you ever have any questions, definitely ask. There's usually lots of information that is given out with each vaccine. It'll very carefully highlight situations where you may not want to get the vaccine, and so you should definitely read that before agreeing. If you can't, I would, if it's hard to find a vaccine, I know especially for COVID now, it's just really difficult to access them. But other vaccines, most of them are still available. Occasionally they experience shortages, but I would suggest, try pharmacies, local clinics, your healthcare providers, local hospitals. There's usually, some information that these folks have or that's online that can guide you to where to get the vaccines.
We have one more question about, I'm guessing that the question is, if you smoke, can you get the COVID vaccine?
That's a good question. I think you can. The vaccine, it's not an aerosol. So some respiratory vaccines are actually like a nasal spray. And so if you're smoking and the smoke gets exposed to the tissues that the vaccine is going to get exposed to smoke, that may throw off the response to the vaccine. But the COVID vaccines so far are injections, so they get injected into the muscle of your arm. So I don't think smoking will influence that. They do not, just overall to help prevent against COVID, they suggest that smoking may make you more susceptible to more severe infections. So I would keep that in mind. And in general, that's something that, smoking can impact your health, and usually in not a favorable way. And with infectious disease, it may make you more susceptible to infection by those viruses. I don't think it will influence the vaccine, though. It would be safe to get the vaccine.
I think that answers the question. They were asking, I think for a parent or grandparent maybe who has been smoking for a long time, if they'd be able to get the vaccine. And I think you've answered that.
Yeah, I think I would recommend that they would. I'm not a physician. I'm not an official person that can actually distribute the vaccines. I'm a scientist. I know a lot of physicians that distribute vaccines, but I'm not one that can actually inject the vaccine into people. But I would suggest that they probably should be first, one of the first in lines to get the vaccine, because being elderly, they're more susceptible, and smoking probably makes them more susceptible as well. So they would benefit greatly from having the vaccine.
Awesome. That's all the questions we have right now.
Great questions. Thank you. So just a couple more things on just vaccines, and a little bit on the immune response, and then we'll open up the floor to all your questions. So one of the reasons people don't get a vaccine is because they're concerned about safety. And again, that is a very important thing to think about. There are sheets that safety sheets that are given to everyone about vaccines, so you read them carefully. But normally, vaccines go through a very strict review and approval process and trials in people before they would even get to the general population for use. So the question then is, before a vaccine gets approved, how many people is it usually tested in? Is it maybe 10 to 20 people just to see what happens? Is it hundreds of people, thousands of people, millions of people? So generally, I'm hoping you think it's hundreds to thousands. Usually, it's thousands of people in the final phase. The testing process goes through three general phases. They call it phase 1, 2, and 3. And even after the vaccine is approved, there's a phase 4. So initially, vaccines are tried out in animals to look for safety. Animals, we don't really want to use them a lot in research and science, but they can be a very useful model for testing safety and whether the vaccine induces an immune response. And then generally, we like to go to people as quickly as we can. But again, the cautions are there. We find the healthiest people we can, and 10 or 20 people in the first early phase inject very low doses of the vaccine to see if it's safe and there's a response. And if that looks okay, then it would expand to a larger group of people, maybe 100 people. And then at that, maybe a little bit higher dose. And if that's okay, then it expands really to thousands of people, which is a really big undertaking. And if it works well in tens of thousands of people, and there are no safety issues, major safety issues, then it's generally approved for use to the general public. But the government ultimately makes that decision, but they rely on a panel of sometimes 20 or more scientists who all meet and look over the data and decide, thumbs up or thumbs down, is it worth, releasing this vaccine? Is it protective? Is it safe? But even after that fact, because even trying it in thousands of people, we're not really sure. When you get into millions of people and hundreds of millions of people in the country and worldwide, you still don't know if things might happen. So there are monitoring mechanisms in place. So if things do happen after the vaccine is licensed in a million people, that will be a cause for concern, and we'll revisit it. So even once the vaccine is approved, like the COVID vaccines now, they're still being watched very carefully. And if there are any safety issues, they likely will pull the vaccine off the market.
We did have one more question come in. Someone was asking if people have to get the COVID vaccine.
No, they're not making it mandatory. As far as I know, generally, it's really up to, I guess, federal guidelines, state guidelines. I think where we see some mandating of vaccines is been at the level of school attendance, say for public schools. So, and I think some colleges are recommending vaccines before college. I don't know if they're requiring it, but I think folks, I think they're strongly suggested. They're but I don't know how often they're required. So it is, we live in a free country. I think in other places they may be much more strict and mandatory, but still I think while they're strongly suggested, nobody's really going to actually force everyone to do this. So we're hoping that people volunteer and agree. But if you have concerns, of course, if you have health issues, we're not really going to force people to get this against their health, concerns, or perhaps other issues.
I wasn't sure if this was a question I asked, but they weren't sure either. One of the students was a little surprised, I think, that animals are used in the vaccine trials.
So we try to limit their use as much as possible, but the immune system, so ultimately we're trying to activate the immune system, and we can study, and in my lab, we study the immune cells outside of the body. So we learn as much as we can just looking at the cells from humans and how they respond to viruses and potential vaccines. But the immune system is very complex. It circulates throughout all of the body's tissues. It communicates with all of the tissues in the body. You really need a whole body system to really test the vaccine to make sure it works. And animals have been a preferred way to do this. So there are, and probably an upside of this is there are many successful animal vaccines that have been developed by trying out human vaccines in animals. So they may work well. Many times vaccines work well in animals, but not people. And we're still learning those reasons why. So so while they're being tested, it is done in a humane fashion. It's done in ways similar to the way human trials are handled. In some ways, it's even more humane. I mean, there are lots of protections in place so that the animals aren't subject to a lot of excess stress or duress. So there is a lot of sensitivity in the research community to animal use. We definitely want to minimize the number of animals that we use. And when we use them, we're handling them as germanely as possible.
And there was a follow-up there. Someone mentioned that they thought animals couldn't get COVID, but I thought I saw in the news that there were some animals who have gotten COVID.
Yeah, interestingly, I've heard in zoos, I've heard like lions and things have been diagnosed with COVID. I also heard somewhere of a dog, a companion animal getting COVID. So again, these viruses grow and mutate, and they have the potential. They can colonize as say you're coughing and sneezing and whoever's infected spreading the virus, they get breathed in by all the animals and people around them. Whether or not they can infect is perhaps up to whatever changes happened in the virus while it was growing in the previous host. So the viruses, you can be colonized by the virus. It may not be able to grow, but you would still be able to detect it in that initial exposure phase. So while I think the zoo lions actually had symptoms. So that suggested that, the virus did more than just kind of land in their sinuses. It actually started growing and causing an immune response. Whether that's true for other animals, I don't know. But I know with influenza virus, so another serious respiratory agent, presumably it can infect horses, dogs, cats, and it can kind of ping pong back and forth to people. So that is a concern. Whether or not they'll approve a vaccine for other animals will be interesting to see with COVID.
We're getting a lot of questions about the animals. There's a lot of concern. So I think one student was concerned about if you have a pet and whether or not they can get COVID. And then someone else was asking about underwater animals. And my understanding is I think they're different enough that maybe they wouldn't be able to get it, but you might know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I don't know much about, and I don't think the science community knows much about underwater animals. I think I read somewhere where someone said whales can get flu. So, but yeah, I mean, when you think the viruses, a lot of the respiratory things float around in the air, and that makes them easier to catch and breathe in. When they hit the ocean, you think that would dilute, the ocean is vast and, lakes and rivers and so on. You think that would dilute and somehow kind of wash away the virus. But there's always a chance, that, the virus could get to an animal and do something. But that would be kind of interesting to look into. I don't know if anyone is doing that.
Well, we'll have to stay tuned. There's a lot of animal lovers in the chat, I think. Thank you.
That's good. That's good. And actually, yeah, vaccines up until this point with the COVID vaccine, it's been a lot easier and faster to develop animal vaccines. And so that's kind of more, if you like to think of vaccines in that, it's actually a more exciting space because there's a lot more kind of cool technology in animal vaccines really than there has been in human vaccines. And it's great. I mean, the vaccines are, widely used, of course, for dogs and cats and farm animals as well. So. Okay, so I have a few more slides. Really, it's getting kind of technical, so I'll try just to hit some of the highlights. With vaccine technologies, if the virus and target is in the middle there, it's showing the core with the RNA for coronavirus, the kind of outer shell with the spike proteins. You can use that whole thing to target the immune system, to train the immune system to protect you against the virus. or you can use just a part of it, like a subunit, just the spike protein. So the current vaccines that are licensed for COVID really just focus on the spike protein. You can even take a gene from one virus and put it into a different virus and use that for a vaccine. So one virus brings in the genes for another virus, and that's a little bit of what we do in our lab, where we're developing viral vectors to put genes from other viruses in, so you can vaccinate against several different viruses with one virus. And then you can whittle it down even more to just the DNA or RNA. And so really the two COVID vaccines are just bits of RNA corresponding to the spike protein that are used as the vaccine. So it's really kind of cool and high tech. And then you can even just use peptides, just the building blocks of the spike protein as a vaccine. So you can go from the whole virus all the way down to just some of the building blocks of the virus. So this is a quick slide on showing the two COVID vaccines now are just the RNA corresponding to that spike protein wrapped in what they call a lipid nanoparticle. So it's a very small assembly, and that lipid wrap protects the RNA so it doesn't get chewed up by our immune system after it's injected. And it also helps that RNA get into a cell. So in a way, it mimics a virus infection, but it's not a virus. What it does is that RNA gets inside the cell, it makes proteins, and those proteins show up on the surface of your cells, and that makes the immune system think there's a virus infection going on. The immune system recognizes that's a new protein, and it responds. But since it's just that one protein, it really can't cause infection, it doesn't cause disease, but it can cause an immune response. So in a way, we're kind of tricking the immune response to think that we are infected when really we're not. We're just expressing a new protein. But that should then gear up the immune defenses so that if it ever sees that same protein again, it will completely knock it out. It'll completely knock out the virus. So here's a really tricky one for everyone to think of, and we'll have to give a prize to anyone who gets this right. So what part of the immune system are we really trying to increase, build up, and boost by vaccines? So this is getting kind of into the nuts and bolts of the immune system a bit. So is it just the overall number of cells like neutrophils and macrophages? And these cells are able to eat up viruses. So they're like Pac-Man or amoebas. They just go around the body and chew things up that are bad. So is that what vaccines are trying to increase? Or there's a molecule called interferon that our cells make that shuts down virus growth. Are vaccines trying to boost interferon? Or are they trying to increase antibodies? And antibodies will stick very specifically to the virus and block it so that it can't get into cells and cause infection. Or lastly, is it T cells? And T cells will recognize virus, and when they activate, they'll activate a lot of protective responses, like antibodies and macrophages and so on. So this is a tricky one. I don't know how many folks have studied the immune system. It's something. It could be, hopefully it's in the curriculum. Anyway, so the answer is the last two. So antibodies and T cells are the very specific molecules that we're trying to activate and increase by the vaccines. So just generally, and why do we vaccinate? So why? Normally you get infected, your immune system will respond and limit the virus, but sometimes the virus wins. Why is that? So those protective mechanisms, I don't know if I can go back, the antibodies and T cells take several days initially, sometimes weeks to generate. Whereas say the neutrophils and macrophages and interferon, those work right away. So those protect us from the moment the virus enters the body. Antibodies and T cells, though, are probably more effective, but they take longer to generate. So it says super detailed things showing that basically there's different times of the immune response, and the vaccine tries to hurry up the response that takes longer to develop. And once it develops, though, it's super powerful, and it usually lasts for a lifetime. So it has a thing called memory. So your immune systems, antibodies, and cells that you generate to the vaccine, they stay in your body for pretty much your whole life. So if you ever get exposed to that virus, they'll shut it down before it can do any harm. So that's what makes it so cool. That's what this slide is showing. So the memory response is really what we're trying to get at with vaccines. It really speeds up those antibodies and T cells. It makes them much more powerful. You think of it as really you're building the army in your body to fight the infection, because it is an arms race. The virus gets in there and grows really fast. It makes millions of copies and it starts spreading everywhere. And the immune system responds the same way. It makes lots of cells, lots of antibodies to fight back. And so if that army is already built up and there waiting, the virus has much less of a chance, if any at all. And then these immune forces tend to localize to the sites of infection too. So they're there, say in the lungs and in your sinuses, waiting for the virus. So it really doesn't have much of a chance at all. And then just a couple slides, really, this is showing it in the kind of the diagram level. I like graphs and diagrams. So overall, before a vaccine or before you're exposed to an infection, you may have one blood cell out of thousands that are circulating in your body that could respond to an infection. But when you inject a vaccine, that expands, that cell number grows. And it keeps growing. So a lot of times we'll give boosters, so that'll increase the number of cells that are shown on the left. And even after the response kind of dies down, you'll get a real immune response initially. Even after that subsides in a couple of days or a week, those memory cells that you build up stay in circulation for life. And then with antibodies, there are factors that are secreted in blood. And actually, they show up in our secretions. They're in tears and mucus, saliva. So those levels get boosted, and then they get shed basically in our saliva for life. So everything you've been exposed to that's infectious, every vaccine that you've gotten causes these responses that your whole body will make the rest of its life to protect you. It's really cool. Couple more diagrams and we'll be finished. So this is showing antibodies, what they do. Antibodies are kind of these Y-shaped molecules, blue molecules that are all over the place. So they're very, very specific for whatever they're generated to, perhaps the spike protein of the virus. And you make lots of them, and they bind very specifically and tightly, and they don't let go. So basically, they coat the surface of the virus with big protective proteins, and they block the virus's ability to get into cells. And also when they coat the virus, it makes it more tasty to those amoeba-like cells, the Pac-Man-like cells that gobble up things that look wrong in the body. So the phagocytes, when they see those antibody-coated viruses, they mop them up and chew them up very rapidly. And then a super detailed slide. This is showing again, maybe one cell in the bottom panel, a naive cell, that blue cell that could respond to coronavirus if you hadn't been infected or you hadn't been vaccinated. But if you get vaccinated, that cell grows and divides. You're building the army. A lot of those cells will go away after the infection or after the vaccine, because that's just a normal part of the immune response. But then also a lot will survive as memory cells. So you've built that big initial army. You don't need it all, after the infection or the vaccine gets removed. But then there are memory cells all the way in the right-hand side that have increased in number and power and their ability to recognize and clear the infection. So I know this is a lot of details, but I'll include these slides. And if you want to look at, some of these a little bit later, then I hope they're a good source of information. So thank you for your attention. Just briefly, the things that we've talked about, and you're welcome to ask more questions on. There are lots of new human coronaviruses that we're discovering in the last 10 or 20 years. And really COVID-19 is just kind of the most recent part of an overall trend. So we think we really want to have to be on the lookout for more viruses of this type and think of ways of stopping them before they can cause serious disease. We talked really briefly about different types of viral vaccines. We're really getting to see kind of the usefulness of the technologies. It's getting better. I think it's getting safer. every year. So I think that is our real hope against, limiting these viruses once, these new ones do appear. And talked a little bit about immune protection and what we're trying to get at, and what vaccine scientists are focusing on. We're really looking for those memory responses that we know from the case with previous vaccines can protect populations for a very long time. So that's all I have for now. I'm willing to take your questions.
Yeah, we have several. So if anyone does want to unmute themselves, you are welcome to do that. I'm going to start with the first question we received, which is, can you get COVID if you always stay inside and never leave your house?
As long as no one else comes in. So, and I think, yeah, that's we're really trying to slow down the spread of the virus. But I think, at some point, right, you can't stay in the bubble forever. So, but in theory, if you limit human contact, or perhaps, contact with animals that might be carrying the virus, then yeah, usually the viruses don't survive very long outside of the body. And so the most likely route of getting infection is being by another person that has the virus. So if you eliminate that, then you should be good.
Another question we have is, and I think this is kind of answered in some of the presentation you had, but can cells die? And if so, how? And does that include good cells?
Oh, yeah, great question. Really good biology question. So, as a future biologist, so cell kind of death is a normal thing. So, most of our tissues, like your skin, for example, your skin is constantly growing, differentiating, and dying every day. So, you see dandruff flakes, or I guess when you get a sunburn, you see that kind of scaly stuff. Your skin normally does that, and that's a protective mechanism. So in a way, it's kind of like forming a wave of tissue that just keeps falling off. And that's an intact skin is a great way of protection. In the immune system, your immune cells, your red blood cells and the white blood cells that fight infection are made initially in bone marrow. And you can make billions of these cells a day. They get released in blood and they percolate through all of your tissues. A lot of them only survive about a week or so. And so there's a huge amount of turnover in your blood cells. So a lot of them they only survive a couple of weeks, but then, a billion more are made. So it's the body is really kind of always in equilibrium. You always have cells growing, dividing, being made, and you have always cells that are normally dying. And that's a normal part of biology. When cells don't die, you can get in things like cancer. So, actually, normal cell death is a good thing.
Yeah. And in that bone marrow, production of blood cells, does that include white blood cells?
Definitely, yep. So it's interesting that all of the different blood cell types, the red blood cells that carry oxygen, and all the different immune cells that are clear, so I call them white blood cells, they all derive from one progenitor cell type. And it's really cool. And when you think of when you were born, you initially started from one cell type after fertilization, and all the different tissues of your body developed from that one cell type. So that's also true for the immune system. There's one type of progenitor cell in your bone marrow that gives rise to all the different blood cell types that circulate in the body. It's really cool.
And the white blood cells, what do those do?
So their main thing is to find things that are wrong in the body. So any cells or tissues that look, diseased or ill, any like foreign proteins, like, if you got like, stuck with a stick or something like that, or a puncture wound, you got dirt in there, they'll recognize that, chew it up and eliminate it. Any infectious agent. So as soon as you're born, these cells learn to recognize who you are, and they learn not to respond to that. But then they'll respond to anything that's not you that they encounter.
We have, I think, a myth busting question here.
All right.
So is it true that you have to eat lots of fruit to get rid of COVID. The student says that her aunt got COVID and she ate lots of fruits to fight COVID, and now she's well.
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of potential ways why or reasons why that happened. Overall, I'm thinking your best defense before getting the vaccine, since it's hard to find, is really, and this is true for all infectious agents, your best defense is keeping your immune system healthy. So your immune system can deal with a lot of viruses and whatnot, but you have to treat it right. So you have to get lots of rest, which isn't easy if you stay up really late at night. You have to get good nutrition, which isn't easy if you're busy doing lots of activities. But hopefully when you're sheltering at home, you have lots of time for rest and nutrition. So, but also a lot of fruits tend to be acidic. And interestingly, a lot of medicines that we use to treat different things have been derived from plants. So some of the protective ability may be due to the acidity that's in the fruits that could maybe kill viruses on surfaces, maybe in the throat, excuse me, or there could be health promoting and immune promoting compounds in the fruit that maybe we haven't identified yet that would boost the immune system.
Very cool. So another question we have, and I think you talked about this in your presentation, but maybe you can distill it a little bit more. So when you get COVID, how does it spread in your body?
That's a great question. So normally respiratory viruses stay confined to the respiratory tract. So they initially infect usually in the upper respiratory in the sinuses, and then sometimes they're eliminated there. But some of the more deadly viruses then kind of drip down into the lungs and get deep down into the lungs. And I think in severe cases of COVID, it gets into the lungs, and you get a lot of fluid buildup there because of that. And it's almost like you're underwater and can't breathe because it's so deep down in your lungs and they get filled with fluid. So I think the most severe effects are from that. But what we also know is the lungs are really in close contact with the blood supply. So it's very easy too, when you have inflammation in the lungs, for these organisms to get into the blood. And when they get into the blood, they can go everywhere. So there is some question now as to can COVID get to the brain? So I think they're starting to look at that now and cause disease by actually getting into the brain. But we know also that it may be able to shed and spread through the stomach. So, and that's kind of a unique thing to coronaviruses, where I guess as it's dripping down, the back of your throat, of your sinuses going towards the lungs, it can also get into your stomach. And some viruses can survive, the low pH or the high acid of the stomach. And so it can cause diarrhea and, stomach illness, and maybe shed and spread, when you go to the bathroom. So you think you want to be careful not only of, respiratory hygiene, but then, kind of like food and bathroom hygiene as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Isaiah, I think this question might have been answered already, but when we talked about the white blood cells, those are the ones that are fighting COVID in our body.
Right. Yeah. So so when if you draw like 10 mils of blood or tube of blood, most of it is red blood cells. There are smaller numbers, maybe 1 in 100 of these clear cells, and you call them white blood cells, but they're just clear. And these are the macrophages, the neutrophils. A lot of them are neutrophils, and they're like swarming amoebas. So they circulate in blood, but if you ever get any injury, they leave the blood and they go right to the site of injury, and they just gobble everything up, and they swarm around it kind of like a pack of angry amoebas. It's really kind of fun to see. And so they're really important at that initial defense. But then there's also factors in blood that aren't cells that also help protect. So there are a lot of molecules there that aren't active, but when microbes get nearby, they're triggered to activate, and they can cause a lot of protective mechanisms as well. And then, of course, when antibodies are made usually, weeks after an infection or a vaccine. They stay in circulation forever. and some are actually to go from blood into your secretion. So they kind of go through the tissues. And so as you kind of blow your nose or, you're iced here, there's lots of antibodies there that can, so the liquid will wash away, viruses, but those antibodies will specifically stick to the viruses and make sure they can't, bind any of your cells.
Awesome. So we've got another question from a student. Her mom says that if you get the COVID vaccine, you may actually still get COVID.
Wow, that's a great thing. So yeah, a lot of vaccines aren't what we call it sterilizing immunity. So in an ideal world, you would get the vaccine and any virus that landed on your body would immediately be blasted away and neutralized, eliminated. But that's usually not the case. So the immune system will protect you, but the virus can still sometimes grow just a little bit. But presumably the stronger your immune system, the less the virus has a chance of doing that. So there is still a chance. And so that makes it a little more complicated. So, if most everyone gets vaccinated and there's still virus out there, there is a chance that, the virus can still land and cause very minor infections, but still be transmitted. And then the issue that's starting to show up now is that the coronavirus is still changing. So just because it's in us doesn't mean it's going to stop mutating and causing variations. And they're starting to see lots of variations already. So the challenge for vaccines, this could be a very difficult virus to make an effective vaccine to, because if it keeps changing, it may escape. It may look completely different on its spike protein than what the vaccine is engineered to do. So for example, flu changes a lot, and our flu vaccine now is actually 3 different strains, and you have to make that up every year. You have to see what's circulating in Australia 6 months ahead of time, and then they make those 3 strains into the vaccine for us later on in the year. We may have to do that with coronaviruses. There may be several different versions of these things circulating, and each year we may have to come up with a different vaccine mix to protect against them. So I think it will be challenging.
Awesome. We have another question from a student. I've told them they can ask one more question after that. So if anybody has another question, please ask it. Also, while we're answering this question, I've dropped a survey into the chat. Please fill that out. We definitely need feedback on this Google Meet platform. And teachers, I'll send one to you as well later. So the question is, to prevent COVID, is there anything that we can eat?
I think really overall you want to eat healthy foods. And really that's the best thing for immune system. So, lots of fruits and vegetables, not a whole lot of fried foods. I know that's difficult, but it's really, I think you think holistically, it's the overall picture. You want to get lots of rest, eat healthy meals, exercise. That just boosts your immune system, all of those normal responses. So when you think of the immune responses that aren't really targeted by the vaccine, so those neutrophils, the interferon responses, anything that helps your body be healthier will boost those responses and make you more protected. So, and kind of it's like you're just making your body's own natural responses stronger. And then really the vaccine then, kind of doubles down and activates that memory component. So I don't know of anybody that's, said, drinking tea. For some virus, I heard like drinking tea was good. So, but yeah, I don't know of any clinical trials. There's probably some anecdotal evidence that different things may work, but as a scientist, you tend to be skeptical, and you really until you actually proved it, it's hard to really say any one thing is effective.
Awesome. I think we have one question. Julius, did you have a raised hand? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask.
Yeah.
We're having a little trouble hearing you. Maybe you want to bring your microphone close to your mouth.
I think if any way to stop COVID. So I asked this question earlier, but like, would it be possible if people with different types of health problems could get the vaccine?
So I think this is, a question we asked earlier about if someone with health problems would be able to get the vaccine.
Yeah, I think so. When the vaccines are tested, it's usually always in healthy subjects. So we don't know. We know not a lot less about how it could act or interact or be safe in people that have health issues. So and sometimes the people with health issues get enrolled in the trial and they're fine. Other times, I don't know, aware of any for COVID specifically, but I can imagine there are some that it may not be good. So I think the one safety issue that has been communicated is an allergic response. So I would say, some people develop a very severe allergic type response to the vaccine, and that's why they're monitored about 15 minutes or so after the administration. So I would say I would be cautious if you have allergies, and I know a lot of folks do, and I would let them know. I think you can still get the vaccine, but I would definitely let them know that you do have allergies, and that's something that they should keep a close eye on to make sure that you don't overreact when getting the vaccine. So,
Yeah.
so too much of a response in the case of allergy would be bad. But and even the folks that are immune suppressed, since this doesn't have a growing agent, doesn't have a growing virus component, the current vaccines are really essentially a killed piece of RNA. There really shouldn't be any danger to that in people that don't have optimum immune responsiveness.
I saw another raised hand. I don't want to keep you too late, but if you're okay answering maybe one more question.
That's fine.
It pops up really quickly, so whoever that was, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
But definitely to follow up with Julius, talk to your doctor or healthcare provider if you have any issues at all, any questions. They're there really to answer those questions, and they would know best. How to recommend the vaccine or not. So.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, please take a moment to fill out that survey. Please take a moment to thank our presenter. And if you are interested in getting information about NKU, I've also dropped a link in there. NKU also often has really cool opportunities to work with researchers. So you can, I highly recommend finding out more. It's never too early. I know 6th grade seems early, but get started, learn all you can, and you'll be ready to make your decision when the time comes.
Yeah, then I can add also, recently we've had an infectious disease physician. His name is Dr. Alan Cohen. He just retired from St. Elizabeth's. He's been interacting with a lot of my classes as well as a lot of the lab research. So it's kind of a shame that he couldn't be here. I think he's done. He's on the university's COVID response team, and he's done. I think you might be able to find some YouTubes of him, perhaps through the university. So he's actually treated infected patients, given vaccines. So he would really be the health expert that initially I would point you to for questions. But he is someone that is really involved in NKU, and I think has really been a really positive influence on me and the students and the university.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. This will be available on YouTube. It's we have someone who's out on maternity leave right now, so I'm super behind on getting everything done. But the last presentation, this presentation, will be up on YouTube very soon. And feel free to sign up for any of the future field trips. We have a lot of really cool speakers coming up. I am personally really excited about the one talking about dog therapy. And I know there were some animal lovers on this chat, so you might be interested in that too. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.